Welcome, everyone. My name is Bassima Alghussein, and I am the proud executive director of Middle East Policy Council in Washington, D.C., responsible for the world-famous Middle East Policy Journal. We're here today as part of our live contributor dialogue series to discuss a very impressive and compelling article that was recently published in our journal, Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine. I'm here today with all four authors, and I will allow them now to introduce themselves. Rania.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having us today. My name is Rania Muhareb. I'm a consultant with the Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq, and I'm also a PhD student at the Irish Center for Human Rights.
I'm Bram Wispelwey. I'm an internal medicine doctor at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and co-founder of Health for Palestine, a community health worker program in Palestinian refugee camps.
David.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Mills. I'm a pediatric emergency medicine physician and an instructor in pediatrics at Harvard Medical School.
Mads, you're on mute.
That is right. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry. Thanks for having us. I'm speaking to you from the very northern part of northern Norway. I'm a medical doctor, anesthesiologist by training, emergency medical physician, and I've been working with the Palestinians with medical solidarity work for the last 40 years, and I'm happy to join the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have all of you with us today. Rania, for those who have not had the chance yet to read the article, I do want to make sure everybody knows that the article Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine is free. It's available online. You can find it in our journal through our publisher, Wiley. And all you have to do is simply put in Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine in Google, and it will pop up. So for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, Rania, could you please give us a brief overview of what it is about?
Absolutely. And I'd really encourage people to read it because it talks about a lot of the issues that Palestinians face when narrating their own lived experiences, but also what challenges there are when publishing on Palestine and Palestinian health more specifically. So basically our piece, the story behind our piece starts in March last year when the four of us published a letter in the Lancet that was titled Structural Violence in the Era of a New Pandemic, the Case of the Gaza Strip. And this short letter intended to warn against the potential devastating impacts of the pandemic in the Gaza Strip due to conditions of structural violence, and particularly the illegal closure and blockade, decades of occupation, and of course the denial of the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. And unfortunately, only 3 days after it was published on the 27th of March, the letter was taken down from the Lancet website. So we inquired as to why the letter was removed, and the reason that was given to us was that there had been intense pressure on the editorial team at the Lancet, threatening boycott of the Lancet by the US scientific communities and elsewhere if they did not take down the letter. And so our letter was taken down within 3 days. And what we did in Permission to Narrate is we talked not only about that censorship, but we also talked about the fact that there's a longer history of medical censorship of literature on Palestine. And we used the title of Edward Said's famous paper from 1984, which was titled Permission to Narrate. And so in doing so, we tried to make it clear that the question of censorship and denial for Palestinians of space to speak and to talk about their lived experiences is something that hasn't happened, that didn't start last year, but that has been ongoing for many decades. And with the piece, what we intended to do is, first of all, to contextualize the context in which our piece was taken down, and also to talk about the threats that the Lancet has been subjected to, as well as other medical journals when publishing on the reality of Palestinian health on the ground, and of course the conditions of the Israeli occupation that have undermined it. And essentially this was the focus of our piece, but we will be talking more, I guess, in this discussion about some of the background around it and some of the specific details in the piece.
Excellent, Rania. And just to clarify, for people who are not familiar with the Lancet, can you just briefly explain what the Lancet is?
Yeah, of course. So the Lancet is one of the oldest, most prestigious medical journals based in the UK. And so it published our letter in March last year. And I just wanted to say also that within the few days that our letter was on the website, it was amongst the top 5% most discussed research publications, which shows that there had been a lot of attention to the piece before it was taken down.
Which was probably part of the reason why there was such a movement to take it down. So thank you. Well, this brings me to my first question, which is directed towards Mads. And this question is, how do activism and medicine work together? How can they ideally work together? Mads, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you. I'll start with a quote from the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, in an editorial that he wrote in 2009 during the Israeli attack on Gaza. Then he said that to stay inactive make you complicit in preventable tragedies with long-lasting public health consequences, unquote. And I think he's right. I've myself been a medical activist since I graduated as a medical doctor here in Norway in 1973. Being a medical professional, I consider it my professional obligation to go beyond the compassionate individual treatment of individual patients and their diseases and injuries, and to actively combat the causing factors, be it a bug, a pollution, or inequalities in society. If I don't do that, I may actually contribute to more disease. The impact on health by poverty, military occupation, discrimination, and institutionalized oppression and structural racism should not only be actively researched, but it should also be actively changed by the help of medical professionals who choose side for the affected population. Such medical activism should imply what I call evidence-based solidarity. That means that we actively research and find professional knowledge about the relation between disease, ill health, and the circumstances people live under, and make the important leap from just treating symptoms and researching society factors of ill health to actively engage and participate in the change of the root causes in society. So to conclude, I think as medical professionals, we must leave this proposed neutral position and actively choose a side with those that carry the burden of structural dispossessment, and do as Habermas says, to combat the illusion of objectivity. And I'd like to close with a quote from the German pathologist Virchow, who said that politics is just medicine with other means, and the doctor should be the advocate of the poor. I think it is my obligation to be an activist, not, of course, being anything else but neutral in my individual relation to each patient. But when I go to Palestine, I go to Gaza because I've chosen side with the Palestinians, because I think they need not only medical support, but more knowledge, more research, and more activism to stop the root cause, which is the occupation, the siege, and the repetitious Israeli bombings. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Mads. My next question is for David. In your letter to the Lancet last March, you discussed structural violence in Palestine during the COVID-19 pandemic. What impact does structural violence have on medicine, specifically in Palestine and also more generally?
Great, thank you again for having us. And I think this is a perfect transition from Mads' piece that he was just discussing. So just to give a really kind of one-liner on structural violence. So structural violence describes essentially the social structures, economic, political, legal, religious, cultural, that end up preventing people in societies from reaching their full potential. And they are structural in the means that they're embedded in our societies, and they're violent as they impair human life. And for practitioners of medicine or public health like us, this ultimately leads to early death and more disease. Another way you can think about structural violence is as social injustices. So thinking about structural racism, thinking about poor housing, poverty, occupation that affects the ability not only to access care, to get education, even to be able to pursue justice. And so when we wrote our concerns about structural violence in the evolving era of COVID, we were essentially throwing up the red flag to the international community that Palestinians in Gaza are at particular risk of succumbing to illness due to these historical and political determinants of health, particularly, as Mads mentioned, occupation and siege, that has led to a fractured healthcare system and limited capabilities to prevent and to manage COVID-19. We were using this impending pandemic. We could have used, any situation that was going on in Gaza to shed light on the larger structural forces at play, really with the idea of moving the conversation from the humanitarian lens to the structural lens.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that very clear and concise answer. My next question is for Bram and Rania. How do continued settlement construction and a lack of equal rights for the Palestinians, specifically the freedom of movement, impact the right to health in Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the right to health in Palestine and the state of the healthcare system, it's really important to have a framework that helps us understand why is this settlement construction, continuing, why don't Palestinians have equal rights, why are they stateless, right, in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and so, I think where that always brings me, and I think the helpful framework to really understand this is the one of settler colonialism. So when you look at any settler colonial context, whether the United States, whether it's Canada, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, or Israel, Palestine, you'll find that the indigenous population, in this case Palestinians, always has, worse outcomes. In some cases, when you look at diseases like diabetes in all of these contexts, much worse outcomes, 2 times, 3 times, even 4 times as high rates of these diseases, right? And this isn't because of, any biology, it isn't because of culture, right? It's because of historical and continued oppression, right? And that's set up in a way that, it's not accidental. So, as Patrick Wolf noted about settler colonialism, right, the goal of settler colonialism is the elimination of the native, right? And this really distinguishes it from other forms of colonialism that we might be maybe more familiar with, right, where you think about sort of domination and exploitation of resources and of human labor, right? But in this case, again, as in, where I'm from, the United States, you're talking about really dispossessing, displacing the indigenous community, right? And that inevitably leads to poor health and a lack of rights. This is why Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, calls settler colonialism really the worst form of colonialism, and it's often the most invisible, which again is by design. So the goal, because the goal is really to have as few Palestinians as possible on the land. Many, 70% of Gaza and, even up to 30% of the West Bank of Palestinians there are refugees, right, from what is now the state of Israel, this fragmentation of the people. You also see this in their healthcare systems, right? So really, again, de-development, fragmented healthcare systems, patchwork from the UN, from the Ministry of Health, the Palestinian Authority, or the authority in Gaza, right? And then this burgeoning private NGO network. None of these systems really working together, ultimately leading to this, to a fragmented reality and really a lack of health, ideal health contexts and rights.
Thank you, Bram. Before we move on to Rania, for those people who are watching who are not familiar with the term settler colonialism, how could you define that for them?
Yeah, and so essentially, when you think about moving a population to another, so in this case, often Europeans, right? There's 2 ways to move a population into another land, right? One is in sort of migration, where the population doesn't seek to assert itself in a superior state or in a more powerful state, right? And then we think about that as migration, right? More like guest population. But then when you have the intention of moving to another place, right, and setting yourselves up as this, a superior force within the land, and in the process, moving or eliminating indigenous peoples, right? Again, like in North America, this is what's called settler colonialism. So the specific goal is to set oneself up in a land in which you're not originally from, in a position of power. And that's really how it differs from migration, and how it differs from other forms of colonialism where, you know, moving your population from one place to another isn't necessarily the main goal. And feel free, Rania, to expand on that if that's not entirely clear.
Excellent, thank you. Rania?
I think that was very clear. And I wanted to build on that point that Bram was making, which is that what we've seen over the past year and a half is that the COVID pandemic has really exacerbated those root causes of Palestinian oppression. And that is why we talked about structural violence at the time in March. That was at the very beginning of the pandemic, but the way it has played out has unfortunately really confirmed the concerns that we had raised at the time. And building on this understanding that the root causes are Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid over Palestinians. I can talk a bit more about that. But the idea is that the right to health is really dependent on those structures of oppression, and enjoyment of the right to health by Palestinians depends on their enjoyment of every other right. So this is something that international human rights law recognizes in general. And so international human rights law talks about underlying determinants of health. Meaning that the right to health is not just about accessing and receiving medical care, it's also about enjoying fundamental rights and freedoms. And that, of course, includes adequate housing, adequate food, access to water and sanitation, the right to a healthy environment, and a whole range of rights, which in the case of Palestine, we see are violated on a systematic basis. So when we look at the situation in Palestine, we see that Israel violates, on the one hand, the right to health in terms of Palestinians' access to care, including through the restrictions on freedom of movement, but it also directly attacks Palestinian healthcare workers and healthcare facilities. But in addition to that, and the way we need to understand structural violence is to realize that Israel denies Palestinians a whole range of freedoms that ultimately prevent them from leading healthy lives. And some examples include the denial of access to essential services, including water, discriminatory planning and zoning, which is inherent in the logic of settler colonialism, house demolitions and expulsions of Palestinians, which we're seeing increasing, and including in Jerusalem over the past few months, and the general denial of fundamental rights to Palestinians. So with this in mind, you will also have seen that around the beginning of this year, there was a lot of talk about medical apartheid and vaccine apartheid on the part of the Israeli government. What this essentially means is that the policies that the Israeli government adopted in relation to the rollout of the COVID vaccine were very much embedded in this institutionalized racism and oppression that Palestinians have known for decades. And this translates into structural violence that includes shorter life expectancies for Palestinians, higher rates of infant mortality, and all of this has been recognized, for example, by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 2019, for example. The same committee also concluded that Israel is in breach of the prohibitions on racial segregation and on apartheid, and therefore we need to understand those root causes when we think about enjoyment or lack thereof of the right to health in Palestine.
Thank you. This brings me to my next question. Mads, could you please talk about some of the stark health inequalities in Palestine that you have personally witnessed and experienced in your 40-year career, and particularly the current health situation in the Gaza Strip? You're also on mute again.
I'm sorry, I concentrate so much on my answer that I forget about the muting. Thank you, Bassima. Good question. I think there are two sources of knowledge to reply to your answer. One is actually the large body of researched evidence on the disparities between health in Israel and in occupied Palestine. And for the last 10 years, there has been a research movement called the Lancet Palestine Health Alliance. And every year, they publish the proceedings of this research. So if you want to go on the internet and find, academic research and evidence on a large body of research done to illuminate, first and foremost, on the health situation for the Palestinian people, you will be able to compare to the health situation on the other side of the borders in Israel. So the research is substantial. It's very clear. There is no doubt that the health conditions, as Rania described, for the Palestinian people, both in the West Bank, in Gaza, and do not forget the millions of Palestinians living in the diaspora, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Jordan, in Egypt, and other places who have a very difficult medical situation because of the refugee status. So the research is evident. The Palestinians in Gaza, for example, they live significantly shorter than their counterparts on the other side of the fence, 200 meters away. You may have 10 years more life expectancy than in Gaza. The maternal mortality rate is very high, extremely high actually, despite the fact that the Palestinians always enjoyed a very high level of academic training. They had a very good healthcare system, and they are, compared to my Norwegian medical system, they are, not behind at all. But because of the structural limitations to explore, develop, and sustain the medical services, they are lacking behind. But the most important difference between the health situation in Israel and in Palestine, as Rania touched on, is the lack of access to the basic preconditions of public health, which is safe water, food security, human security, housing, education, sanitation services, power supply, and then healthcare systems. So many doctors and many people, looking at the healthcare problem think that if you just put in enough doctors, you will fix the problem. No, you will not. If 99% of your water in society is undrinkable, as it is in Gaza, as a result of the Israeli occupation, you will not have a healthy population. If your food supply is limited, yeah.
You know why, Mads? Maybe you could explain just a little bit. Why is so much of the water undrinkable, and why is there such a shortage of water for Palestinians? Because my understanding is there is an abundance of water for Israelis. Could you touch on that a bit?
Yeah. Sure. And again, the Palestinians' right to narrate their own situation will be an important footnote to my answer, because if you want a clear answer to this, you should ask the researchers at one of the two largest universities in Gaza, Al-Azhar University or Islamic University. Many people, and I believe also in the US, do not even know that the Palestinians have rich, very active universities in Gaza for its population, where the average age, by the way, is around 17 years. So the reason for this bad water situation is very extensively researched by Palestinian hydrologists and water experts at these universities. And there are several reasons. Number one, I think, is because the infrastructure in Gaza is very weak and weakened with every Israeli attack. The sewage system, the water pipelines, the pump stations are being bombed. So the Israeli attacks are not, as you hear a lot in the US media, targeting the terrorists. No, it's targeting the society itself, infrastructure, water pipelines. And when you bomb the water pipelines and the sewage system, the sewage leaks into the water pipeline. If you don't have proper power supply for your sewage cleaning stations, you will have an abundance of sewage from 2 million people plus. And of course, this sewage both contaminates the water supply and it contaminates the surrounding waters, which is the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean on its side will cause a very profound influx of saline water into the groundwater. So you need water cleaning stations also run on electricity. And if you don't have electricity because of the siege and the bombing of the power supply, you will not be able to desalinate the water. So this is all reflections of the structural violence, which comes as a very, very logic consequence of the occupation and the siege. As for food, there is a chronic malnourishment in Gaza, which attacks in particular the kids and of course people with ill health. A majority of kids in Gaza are anemic because of lack of sufficient iron in the diet. And a large number of younger Palestinians will be stunted, means that they are too short for age, more than 2 standard deviations shorter than they should have been at that age, which is a very sensitive indicator of protein malnutrition. You have too little protein in your diet. Take the siege of the waters. You know, Gaza is a coastal state or a coastal territory with actually the same rights as I have to go fishing here outside the island I'm on. Norway has 200 nautic miles, which all other coastal states have. The Israeli occupiers are limiting that to a few kilometers. So the fishing fleet of Gaza cannot go out and harvest that food basket, which would be an important source of protein. So water, food, sanitation are being systematically destroyed by not only the bombing, but also by the siege, which limits the possibility for the Palestinian engineers and workers to reconstruct, be it a pump station, be it a sewage pipeline, be it a marketplace. So it's a sort of a double, triple attack all the time. And I would say, you know, I mentioned in the beginning of this answer, there are two sources of knowledge to answer your question. The second source is the reality on the ground. I have seen that. And I urge any of the listeners today, if you doubt what we say, there is one way to find out. Go there, see with your own eyes, experience the West Bank, try to go to Gaza and see firsthand apartheid, racism, and occupation playing out in 2021. I don't know any other place in the world where a government is allowed the kind of impunity that can make this continue with the violations of human rights, so basic right of access to health for a civilian population, which is basically a youngster and child population. And the last thing, the healthcare system in Gaza used to be very good, as I said, has a brilliant staff of professionals, doctors, specialists, nurses, paramedics, whatever. It's being attacked. I have been in Gaza during the last 4 major attacks on Gaza by the Israeli war machine. Every time I see killed paramedics, I see bombed ambulances, and I see bombed hospitals. Now, is that by chance? Is that what they call collateral damage? No, it's not, because the Israelis say that 90% of their explosives and rockets and bombs hit the intended target. And when you have 10th of hospitals being more or less destroyed, and you have clinics being destroyed, of course, that's part of the warfare. And that is illegal according to the Geneva Convention. And with a very deprived population, of course, you need also a good healthcare system. And you need a steady supply of equipment and drugs, which is also very diminished as a cause of the siege. And the last point is that the healthcare workers in Gaza are not being paid their salaries, so they basically work for free. So it's a very multifaceted situation, which as a very hard endpoint affects the population, the civilian population's life expectancy, child mortality, mother's mortality during delivery. All of this should have been stopped years ago and not being allowed to continue. This is not a natural disaster. This is 100% avoidable, man-made, deliberately, and executed by the Israeli government with the support of the American government, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you so much for giving these very clear examples of what structural violence is and how it reinforces itself. When I worked in Congress, I worked for a member of the House Armed Services Committee who was responsible for approving the defense packages. And one of the things that just never made intellectual sense to me was all of the briefings that we would get on just how advanced technologically the Israeli military was and still is, of course, with the support of the United States. But then every time there would be an outbreak of violence, there seemed to be so many mistakes in the targeting or the hitting of hospitals, ambulances, schools, and so on and so forth. So one thing that confused me was how, on one hand, you could have one of the most advanced top technology and intelligence systems supposedly in the world, but then on the other hand, make so many mistakes. So I hope that that's something that my colleagues in Congress will think about. This brings me to my next question. David, How are Palestinian children affected specifically by the conflict between Israel and Palestine? Can you talk about access to healthcare for Palestinian children? Mads already touched on the fact that Palestinian children are almost 2 inches shorter than they should be than their Israeli counterparts just living a few meters away. Why is that?
Great, yeah, and thank you for the question. And I will, I'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the direct and indirect consequences of attacks and war, as Mads initially started with, and talk a little bit more specifically about the pediatric population or the childhood population. So just to give everyone kind of a little bit of a background, 50% of Gaza's population, which is with my colleagues where I work in Gaza, is under the age of 15. And so what does that mean that 50% of that population is under 15? That means that if you're 15 years old, you've experienced 4 to 5 large-scale attacks or wars on your place of living. And so there are direct impacts of these attacks, which make the headlines. For example, back in May, at least 75 children were killed in the attacks on Gaza. Myself and my co-authors here wrote about the health impacts of the Great March of Return of 2018. During that violent suppression of protesting, 49 children were killed, and that was in a year where 714 children in the occupied territories were injured by live fire. The problem, again, just stating these numbers, is that it's difficult to really grasp what these numbers mean. And so one other way to think about it is not only do you have death, but you also have disability. And some of these injuries can be life-changing for children. There are a handful, or even more than a handful, of children from the Great March of Return that will require multiple long-term surgeries for injuries of the lower extremities. There's actually over 700 victims who will be requiring these long-term limb reconstruction surgeries. And so thinking about those as kind of direct consequences of some of these structural determinants, we can also think about indirect consequences. The patients who are undergoing these limb reconstruction surgeries would be a perfect example. Not only can they suffer from chronic pain, many people will be unable to sustain their job. They'll become unemployed. We have seen that there's a significant burden on the social structures of families. And then also the mental health trauma that comes from not only war, but also thinking about the structural determinants. Our Palestinian colleagues in Gaza have written extensively about mental health and impacts of war and on children. And actually over 35% of children prior to May's attacks required support for conflict-related trauma. So the other important thing to mention is that in Gaza, post-traumatic stress disorder, something we know in a Western context, is almost a misnomer because the trauma is persistent, it's ongoing, and it's pervasive. And then finally, I'll just touch very briefly on the access to care. And so really thinking about access to care, not only for children, but for adults, is really related to that structural violence that we were discussing. It takes form in every axis of seeking care. So it starts with the inability to develop a healthcare system to take care of the population in a sustainable way, to develop an educational system to train full spectrum of professionals, even though there are excellent physicians in Gaza, and then also limiting the ability to even seek care outside of Gaza for treatment is the reality of the structural violence of occupation and siege.
Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Brian Barber, who's affiliated with New America and the Gaza Mental Health Institute, and also Dr. Bill Slaughter, who you might be familiar with. He's affiliated with Harvard. And they were explaining to me that even just the sound of a bomb, you obviously have, the children who are killed, and then you have the children who are severely physically maimed. And then even just the sound of bombs going off to a 3 or 4-year-old child is just so traumatizing. and the level of anxiety and depression. And then, of course, we've seen massive increases in rates of suicide. So thank you for touching on that. My next question is for Bram. Bram, Jordan was the first country to vaccinate its refugees at the same time that it vaccinated Jordanian citizens. Could this be done in Israel with the Palestinians? Why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been done, and it should have been done. Honestly, it's a legal, moral, and public health failure of the Israeli state that they did not simultaneously vaccinate the Palestinian population that it occupies, right? And so that includes both refugees and non-refugees. I mentioned the breakdown before. The only Palestinians that are getting vaccinated under Israel's rollout, which has been sort of lauded around the world because of a special deal they signed with Pfizer that gave them early and generous access to the vaccines, were the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but not those in Gaza, not those in the West Bank, right? And so, their obligation to vaccinate Palestinians, right, and refugees and non-refugees, again, stems from the Fourth Geneva Convention, stems from the obligation to provide and share resources in a time of the pandemic. And what's, I think, very important, because this has been mentioned over and over again in print and in a lot of different contexts, is that the Oslo Accords, which were signed in the early 90s, which grant some amount of administration to the Palestinian Authority to deal with health, do not obviate Israel's legal responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention, right? You have the Palestinian Authority, which has, civil responsibility within just 39% of the West Bank, right, is not able to without directly and closely coordinating with Israel to manage a pandemic, right? It's just not possible. And it's not their legal obligation alone, it's also Israel's. And so that you will hear that being mentioned over and over again, that it's the Palestinian Authority's responsibility to vaccinate the population, and it's not true legally. And it's simply a falsehood that we have to stand up to as health providers, right, as clinicians.
And then there was a story in the news in the West that was, Israel gave however many vaccinations to Gaza, and then they threw them away. And I noticed that, at least in the West, the Western news media didn't point out the fact that the vaccinations that the Israelis gave the Palestinians had already expired. So that's something that's really interesting when we talk about kind of the narratives that people have access to. It, again, is a way of painting the Palestinians as being irresponsible, ungrateful, when it's just half the story. Thank you for your answer. Rania, you noted that the Johns Hopkins dashboard incorrectly counted data about COVID in Palestine, and then that the letter about Gaza was removed from the Lancet. How do you overcome the barriers to publish a story that covers healthcare in Palestine? And also, could you give a little bit more background on the Johns Hopkins dashboard situation?
Absolutely. So on the Johns Hopkins University dashboard, the first thing we need to remember, and Bram mentioned this at the beginning, is that the Palestinian people has been systematically fragmented, not just geographically, but also legally and politically. And that became a particular issue at the start of the pandemic, and it, of course, remains so. One of the issues was how to track COVID amongst Palestinian communities when they are fragmented at a massive scale, both within historic Palestine, but also in exile abroad. And that was something that was reflected in what happened with the Johns Hopkins University dashboard on COVID-19, which initially listed Palestine, including the occupied Palestinian territory, and then actually removed Palestine from the map and merged those figures with Israel. It changed the same entry about 2 times after that. It currently reads West Bank and Gaza, but that still leaves the question of Jerusalem up to debate, as we know, Jerusalem, of course, is illegally annexed by Israel, and therefore the figures for COVID-19 have been reported by Israel, except that the annexation is illegal, and so technically East Jerusalem is part of the occupied Palestinian territory, and those figures are not being included there. But WHO has included both East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip in its counts for the occupied Palestinian territory. The idea is that this is one example of the difficulties of navigating Palestinian fragmentation and doing so in the context of the pandemic. And so, of course, following that, our letter in the Lancet was removed on the 30th of March, which was Land Day, when Palestinians protest the mass expropriation of their lands and their dispossession. And the piece was taken down because of the pressure that we talked about earlier from certain physicians from the US and elsewhere. But what we need to realize, and this is what we talked about in Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine, is that this is part of a broader, more concerted campaign that silences Palestinian voices and experiences, silences human rights defenders and organizations, Palestine activism, solidarity and advocacy, but also this translates into the pressure that is put on editors of academic journals to remove content that is critical of illegal Israeli policies and practices. So this is something that we talked about and we looked at in more detail. And unfortunately, our censorship story didn't end there, and I just wanted to point to that before I talk about how we can overcome censorship of Palestine in academic publishing. But I wanted to point to what happened afterwards, which is in September, the Lancet actually published a response to our removed correspondence, which was authored by the head of the Israeli Medical Association. The response actually said that our letter had been so egregious that it required a response 6 months later. And unfortunately, of course, it also did not challenge any of the arguments that we put forward. It only used one reference to a now repeatedly criticized UN comment about close coordination between the occupier and the occupied during the pandemic. And other than that, it only referenced our correspondence, which had been removed. And so the link, of course, led to nowhere.
I see. What you're saying is there were no actual arguments against the scientific data that you presented, but it was rather just an issue with the fact that it had been presented, period.
100%, and that's what we tried to say in our reply as the original authors. We tried to submit an author's reply to the Lancet to respond to the propaganda that was contained in the response from the Israeli Medical Association. And our reply was rejected, even though this isn't the general practice by the Lancet and other journals. But so we weren't even allowed to respond to the response to our letter that had been removed and is still taken off the Lancet website.
And have you all been published in the Lancet before in other contexts or other very prominent medical journals and not had issues like this, right? So this is a very stark contrast to your own experiences when writing in medical journals. Okay.
Our understanding is that this is unprecedented and that it's a new trend in academic censorship. So I wanted to say just how we have managed to also bring attention to the censorship story. And we actually published another piece recently, 2 months ago, at the beginning of June, in the BMJ opinion. And that piece talks about this.
What is the BMJ for
the British Medical Journal, abbreviated BMJ, published a piece in their opinion blog that we had written, and we can make it available to everyone. It's online. So this piece, we talked about political censorship in academic journals, and we drew on this story of censorship that we had been subjected to, but also talking about its grave implications for Palestinians trying to narrate their lived experiences and trying to challenge the violations that undermine their rights to health, life, and other fundamental rights. And one of the things that we emphasized in this recent piece is that there is a growing need for academic journals and the academic community, more generally, to develop a strong position that protects journals, their editors, and their staff from pressure to enforce censorship of Palestine. And what we're hoping is that we've seen over the past few months growing recognition of Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism and calls to decolonize scholarship on Palestine. So we hope that in this context, there can be more traction and more efforts to overcome this form of political censorship in academic publishing. And that would, of course, have a grave impact on the ability of Palestinians to publish on their health situation, but also on Palestine more generally.
Rania, it's really interesting that you bring this up because, you know, as the executive director of the Middle East Policy Council and talking with our audience who are generally policymakers, I can say as a former congressional staffer, as a proud member of the Democratic Party, as somebody who served in the Obama administration, something that really, really motivated me to work for the United States government was and is the United States Constitution and the principles of that Constitution. And we know that in our very first amendment, the founding fathers protected the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And while you're sharing these incidences and they might be happening abroad in British publications or on the ground in Palestine, we can certainly see that it is a huge fundamental separation from our founding principles as a country and our values. That brings me to my next question to Mads. Mads, have you been subjected to censorship when writing about your experiences in Palestine? What was the background to the removal of your letter to the Lancet last March? Take yourself off of mute. Great job.
Yeah, hi, I'm not muted. The only thing that can make me voiceless is that little muting signal, actually. I think the others have also touched much on the driving forces behind this censorship from the Lancet, which, given the role that the Lancet has taken over the last 10 years with the Lancet Palestinian Health Alliance, was surprising. But if you look at it in context, in 2014, we wrote an open letter for the people of Gaza. I worked in Gaza during the 2014 bombing. It was horrible. And it was a broad international group of medical professionals who wrote an open letter that was published in the Lancet. Immediately, there was a campaign started by the pro-Israeli supporters in medicine, mainly coming from settler colonial countries like Canada, US, Australia, as Bram pointed to. And they demanded the removal of the letter, not pointing to any errors or false numbers or statements. And they wanted also, actually, I think the editor sacked. That battle took a good year before the ombudsman, who is sort of an external quality controller of the Lancet, said that there was no reason to remove the letter. So you can still find that in Gaza, in Lancet's archives, an open letter for the people of Gaza. So that was rebutted.
Mads,
yeah.
Can I just share something with you? I mean, this is very interesting because it's basically an example of someone being threatened to lose their job, right? A tactic, a bullying, a method of coercion to maintain certain silence on different issues. And then I noticed in your article, Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine, you noted that there was a large campaign preceding your letter removal to discuss all of the incredible advances that the Israelis have made in health, technology, cancer research, so on and so forth, but yet completely dismissing, overlooking, whitewashing, we could say, all of the incredible damage that is being done.
And that was sort of I think a concession from the Lancet leadership or owners, whoever, to try to calm down the pro-Israeli forces being angered by the fundamental fact that once you start to describe the sharp end of the Israeli occupation, the siege and the military attacks in medical numbers, they try to stop that because it is so dangerous. Let me make a parallel to the US. If we as medical doctors only describe the physiology, the pathophysiology and the anatomy of suffocation injuries suffered by policemen kneeling on the neck of suspect people, that might not be very sort of alarming for society or for the powers, because at anatomical level, of course, this would be an interesting medical fact. But once you see the picture of the policeman kneeling of the neck of Mr. Floyd, and you add to that the medical findings, you have a very explosive attack on the structural violence done by the police rampantly all over the US. And that's the same with Palestine and with Gaza in particular. We could write 100 articles on the type of fractures, on the type of bullet injuries, on the type of blood loss in children having these and these types of injuries, but that would not in any way be an honest description of the situation, because we also have to describe and define the tracer condition or the root cause of these injuries. And once you do that, and once you insert the word Israeli government or Israeli military forces into your scientific publication, you meet a lot of resistance. If you take out that, which describes the sort of the deliberation, the deliberate nature of the attacks and the destruction of human bodies done by a governmental army, not by a terrorist army, not by a ragtag uncontrolled army, but by a governmental army, then it becomes dangerous. And then this army of censors run in and start threatening the editors. And I'd like to quote to you from the 2014 campaign against this open letter for the people of Gaza that Lancet published, and they tried to shoot it down, the pro-Israeli forces. The Association of Diabetic, the president of American Diabetic Associations and the European Association for the Study of Diabetes, they published a statement saying that our medical journals will refrain from publishing articles addressing political issues that are outside either research funding or healthcare delivery, unquote. So they say, we will not publish anything about root causes of misery, of ill health, of population ill health. And once we then try to, or not only try to, but we make the connection between the injuries we see, the misery, the problems with diabetic treatment in the West Bank, and the oppression and the colonizing power Israel, we are being censored. There's absolutely no doubt. It's organized, it's deliberate, and it is from the pro-Israeli medical society, and it has to stop. Because the bullying, as you rightly point out, the bullying of editors makes people, in a way, not only to be punished, but to have some sort of a sentence or a payback demand from these pro-Israeli forces. Like the editor of the Lancet had to go to Israel, give a lecture, and then publish these 4 issues with how wonderful the Israeli healthcare system is, without even mentioning the problems for the occupied Palestinian population, let alone the Palestinians living inside Israel.
This is very, very interesting. And as somebody who, is a very proud Palestinian American who's worked in the American government, I think it's important for me to kind of delineate for my colleagues some of the terminology. So I consider myself to be somebody who is pro-Israel, but I am somebody who, what that means to me, how I define that, is pro a democratic state that upholds democratic values and equal rights for all people, regardless of their race or their background. And so when these entities, groups, or people, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are also pro-Israel in the sense that they support a vision for a democratic, peaceful state. But when I hear the actions by certain organized entities, I wouldn't necessarily, or at least to me, think that they are by definition pro-Israel. They, to me, are anti-Palestinian rights. So these communities or these organizations that are specifically silencing Palestinian voices, data on Palestine, they're more anti-Palestine than they are necessarily pro-Israel, because we know that there's a lot of nuance especially in the United States and among the Jewish American community in terms of, how we define what pro-Israel is. And a lot of people who love Israel, just like a lot of people who love America, understand that criticism is healthy, can be constructive criticism, and comes from a place of love. That I frequently criticize the Democratic Party. I frequently criticize the United States policies, but that's because I want us to always strive to be better. And so I think it's important for my colleagues watching to know that these organizations and groups are specifically anti-Palestinian rights, anti-Palestinian history. And that actually leads me to the next question to Bram. In the article, Permission to Narrate a Pandemic in Palestine, and your recent piece in the British Medical Journal, you talk about censorship of Palestine and the struggle to make academic space for those who challenge dominant healthcare narratives. How do you counter the erasure of Palestinian history and Palestinian present realities? And this is specifically a very important question to me personally, because I can tell you that when I worked in Congress, at the time, the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, actually said in the mainstream press that Palestinians are an imaginary people, that they never really existed. And I can't even share with you or the audience what that felt like for me as a Palestinian American who was serving in the institution that this person at one point led, and to not hear any criticism of that. It was just completely accepted in the media. Whereas if I were to stand up and say, or if anybody were to stand up and say, the Hebrew people do not exist, they are imaginary, they are made believe, they are made up, they would immediately be condemned, as they should, because that is a lack of recognition of facts, of history, of respect for people, for cultural diversity, for religious diversity, and so on and so forth. So can you please talk about how you faced these incidents yourself and how you specifically are attempting to counter this erasure of Palestinian history and Palestinian present day realities?
Yeah, and I mean, and that's such a powerful and disturbing and yet commonplace example of what we call epistemicide, right, in our British Medical Journal piece, right, borrowing a term from Portuguese sociologist De Sousa Santos. Epistemicide, it's not just the destruction of bodies, right, that Mads was just talking about, that he's seen, so painfully so many times in Gaza, right, the disability, the death, all of this material violence, right? It's also the violence of the destruction of indigenous Palestinian knowledge, right? That's what epistemicide means, right? It's the erasing of you, right? Erasing of the idea that there are Palestinians and that there's a whole history and a whole set of experiences that need to be narrated, right? That really need to be narrated. And so the way to do this, right, is, and to borrow a term from critical race theory too, right? We're centering the margins, right? We're taking, the voices of the oppressed, right? Like, this is the idea. Like, we have to hear from people themselves. David and I were part of putting together a webinar during, the attacks in May, where we brought in a psychiatrist, Yasser Abu Jamal, to come and speak, while under bombardment, right, to an international audience, to tell us what is happening right now in the Gaza Strip, right? So that's the important piece there, right? Bringing in Palestinian voices to talk about their lived reality and their lived experiences. And and I have to say that I've been a little bit optimistic in the last few months, in the sense that much of the world now knows who Mohammed and Muna al-Kurd are, for example, in Sheikh Jarrah. And they were given, a significant point. And part of this is because of how social media works, but also on mainstream media, given a voice to narrate their reality of what it looks like to be, to live in East Jerusalem as Palestinians, for example, and what that looks like. And so it means that, and this gets into some of our work too in the British Medical Journal. I'll finish with this, that as your example really shows also, Bassima, that there isn't a balance between these anti-Palestinian voices, as you said. We won't say pro-Israel or we'll say anti-Palestinian voices and Palestinian voices. There's not a balance, right? You're able as Newt Gingrich did, to completely erase them and no one bats an eyelid. Whereas if you simply say, I'm here, this is my lived reality, right? That can't be said, right? So what we need to do is correct that. And that means not equal for both sides. We're talking now about equity. We need to right this injustice of the erasure of Palestinian voices and correct that by moving and amplifying them in any spaces that we can.
So I have two comments on that. The first is I am hopeful that you all saw the Saturday Night Live skit of the news piece that said 50% of Israel's population has been vaccinated. We're pretty sure it's the Jewish side. So I thought that was interesting because that had, seeped into US pop culture. But it actually reminded me of a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer, where he said that truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently repressed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. And it seems to me that social media is helping us to move from the second to third stage. My next question, now that we have more information being spread and more awareness in the international community, my next question is for Mads and David. How can the international community help to raise awareness of the health and human rights situation in Palestine? And what should they do to improve it? Because there is clearly still a very strong push-pull and tension happening.
David?
Mads, I'll let you take this.
Well, pertaining to your last very good point, Bassima and Bram, I think it's always been talked a lot about the voiceless people and being a voice for the voiceless. The Palestinian people, they are not voiceless. They are made voiceless, like the Australian journalist John Pilcher talks about. So to be described as voiceless is a very sort of derogatory way of describing the Palestinians and any oppressed people. They are not voiceless, but we need to listen to them and we need to amplify them and we need to fight for their right to have the platforms to talk about their reality, to give their narrative of their story and their reality today, not only to have the white doctors describe how the situation in Gaza is when there is bombing, because we believe people with blue eyes and blonde hair. No, as Bram said, let's have the Palestinians in focus. Let's give them the microphone, the video cameras, the social platforms, the internet. And you saw during the last bombing in May how this...
Yeah, I mean, Mads, when I worked in Congress, I had one friend in all of Congress who was Palestinian American. And she would lie and tell people she was Lebanese because she didn't want to deal with the discrimination. And I mean, that's obviously, it's changed a lot in the past 10 years. But, again, it's like when you are not even allowed to exist, you're not even allowed to say, when I introduce myself to someone and say, my name is Bassima, and they say, what kind of name is that? It's a Palestinian name. It's incredible. And so I really commend all of you. And one of our missions at MEPC is to, share underrepresented perspectives. And so you're really helping us to fulfill our mission of raising diversity awareness and sharing underrepresented perspectives by being with us today.
Can I just add one little point before David talks? Your question was, what can we do to sort of make an end to this unjust situation? Number one, believe in the young people, because that's what we saw during the May attack, that young people on the internet were making, on TikTok and everywhere, we're making short versions of the Palestinian history. And they used a lot of humor, they used music, and they used their skills. And And the combination of the Black Lives Matter movement and the solidarity for the Palestinians during the last attack on Gaza is quite significant, because young people are the ones who have not been brainwashed into accepting injustice as part of the structural violence. So I have three recommendations. Number one, travel there. Go there, drink a lot of tea with the Palestinians, get to know the Palestinians' families in Israel, in the West Bank, go to the refugee camps in Jordan and in Lebanon, go to Gaza if you can, number one. Number two, read alternative sources and shape your own information system. Don't believe the mainstream media. And number three, make friends with Palestinians on the social media. Adopt a family in Gaza, talk to the young ones, talk to the elders, and show that we can break the barriers, that we can break the siege of Gaza by using modern social platforms and media technology, and stop this completely historical injustice against the Palestinian people by the state of Israel. That's my answer.
When you say to read alternative sources, could you just give, in your medical opinion, supported with our two Harvard geniuses and Rania?
Yeah, from a peasant reader in Norway, I can recommend this one, which is called Middle East Policy, a brilliant paper.
I was responsible for that one.
I know. Number two, the Lancet Palestine Health Alliance.
Okay.
Number three, there is an array of brilliant Palestinian periodicals, which are both in the academic field. Both the Islamic University and the Al-Azhar University are publishing a series on their issues. And there are Palestinian proper cultural outlets, which have very, very strong and powerful Palestinian writers, authors, poets, filmmakers.
And I find that Mondo Weiss, which I know is...
Mondo Weiss is very nice. Electronic Intifada, brilliant. The BDS homepage, brilliant. You just have to do as in the old times. You have to tune on your radio to get the Palestinian senders. Right. They are there, but they are being closed down or they're being obliterated. So do a little work and pop regularly into these Palestinian sources and get their newsletters.
So I will tell you that we will certainly be amplifying, consistent with our mission, different social media accounts from people not only in Palestine but around the world and around the region, so that we can amplify diverse perspectives. But of course, as a Palestinian American who has family in Gaza, I have a lot of Facebook friends who are in Palestine on the ground. And when I worked in Congress, I would drive the congresswoman I worked for crazy, because I would share all of their posts during the siege in 2014, the videos that they were taking from their smartphones. And she would get so nervous because I had all of these friends on my Facebook profile who worked in Nancy Pelosi's office and worked in Chuck Schumer's office and and there was all this like, oh gosh, Bassima, why do you have to be so loud about this? You're sharing it and all these people can see it. And I was like, that's exactly why I'm sharing it, because they need to see it, because I'm friends with them.
And sure, and let me make one footnote to your very important experience. I mean, to be pro-Palestinian is to be pro-human rights. It is to be pro-future and equal rights for everyone. It is not to be anti-Semitic. I am a deeply believing anti-racist. I have lots of Jewish friends. I'm absolutely no racist, and I'm by God not an anti-Semite. Right. So to be pro-Palestinian and to discuss the situation for the Palestinians and to criticize the state of Israel, their occupation, their apartheid, their bombing of Gaza, is not to be anti-Semitic. It is to be pro-future and pro-democracy.
Exactly. I went to Catholic school, and I was taught in kindergarten by Sister Rosemary that two wrongs don't make a right. Okay, well, Rania, what avenues are there for justice and accountability in Palestine? Oh, I'm sorry, David, did you want to add anything?
I think that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Rania?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let me just let me just continue on what Mads was saying about Palestinian sources and using Palestinian literature to understand the reality that Palestinians live. You can also do that by looking at the work of Palestinian human rights organizations, Al-Haq, Badil, Al-Mizan, PCHR in Gaza. There are many Palestinian organizations that are actively documenting human rights violations on the ground, and it's through this information that you can gain a better understanding of what's happening. And of course, the better thing would be to come and see for yourselves. And I want to draw also attention to the work of Al-Shabaka, a Palestinian policy network that publishes widely the voices of Palestinian academics, but also allies working on Palestine and trying to promote a decolonial future on Palestine that is reflective of the reality on the ground. This being said, to talk about accountability is important because we're seeing now growing recognition that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against Palestinians. And I just need to say here as well that this growing recognition comes today, but it isn't a recent or new discussion that is taking place. In fact, Palestinians have been writing on this for decades. For example, Palestinian scholar Faiz Saigh wrote about this in 1965, where he talked about the racial characteristics of Zionist colonization. So this is something that Palestinians have been diagnosing for quite a while, and it is therefore important to really understand that literature and to look at it. But bearing in mind this recognition of apartheid and settler colonialism over Palestinians, what this now requires is that there are also effective measures to seek justice and accountability. And one of the important avenues we have at our disposal today is the International Criminal Court, which has recently launched an investigation in Palestine and also, of course, confirmed that it has jurisdiction over suspected war crimes and crimes against humanity in Palestine. So this jurisdiction would extend also to the crime of apartheid, the crime of population transfer. But what should also be considered in this investigation by the ICC is the systematic attacks on Palestinian healthcare, the killings of Palestinian civilians, including healthcare workers, children, persons with disabilities, journalists, and the widespread attacks on Palestinian infrastructure, including hospitals. So all of this is something that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over, and that should be the subject of an investigation. So this is an important avenue that we need to be promoting in the coming period. Another avenue that I want to highlight, because it allows us to talk about the root causes of Palestinian oppression, is a new avenue that the UN Human Rights Council recently established in May 2021. So it's a commission of inquiry that was appointed by the President of the Human Rights Council to look into institutionalized discrimination, not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also inside the Green Line. So this is the first UN investigatory body that looks at the root causes of discrimination, targeting Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, which is really significant and should be the basis of further advocacy, but also engagement.
What the Green Line is?
Yeah, absolutely. The Green Line is the 1949 armistice line, which divides Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship from Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so it's one of the bases for the fragmentation of Palestinians over the years, which is, of course, artificial because Palestinians on both sides of this boundary face institutionalized oppression in many of the same ways, including through discriminatory planning, denial of access to natural resources, including land, dispossession from their own lands, and denial of access to water and sanitation, amongst other violations that we can see. So the fact that the UN is now, for the first time, looking at the continuity of these practices, which other UN bodies have already recognized, is really significant and therefore is a basis for pursuing accountability. But to this, I just want to add that this is the 11th UN Commission of Inquiry or fact-finding body that has looked into serious violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law targeting Palestinians just over the past 20 years. And what this means is that what we need beyond just the investigation is also actually effective measures to implement recommendations of these bodies to actually pursue justice and accountability in this respect. And the fact that the ICC has an ongoing investigation is an important avenue then.
Okay, so this actually is a perfect lead into my final question, because I am aware of a lot of these different measures that are happening in the international community. And I'm also aware of a lot of the moves by the United States government that block the efficacy of some of those measures. So my final question is, for the US policymakers who are watching, who are listening, who care about all people's human rights, which obviously would include the Palestinian people, what can they do as staff in Congress, as policymakers in Washington, D.C., to help to improve the human rights and the dignity of the Palestinian people?
Thanks for that, Bassima. And so let me start just with one general point on what all states have an obligation to do, including the US. Legally, states have an obligation not to recognize an illegal situation, so to recognize the illegality that is happening, but also not to aid and assist in maintaining that illegality, including through support for illegal Israeli settlements, and of course, military aid that assists in the commission of suspected crimes. And I want to point to that really specifically in relation to the US, because we're seeing an important initiative now in recent months. There's an initiative that was introduced by Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who introduced a bill in order to condition US funding to Israel in an effort to uphold Palestinian rights. And the bill, for example, states the rights of Palestinian children and families under Israeli military occupation. So this is a bill that has received wide support from US civil society as well as Palestinian organizations. And it's an important initiative that policymakers should support and co-sponsor. And in addition, what I want to say is that we're seeing continued assaults on Palestinian rights. So what this requires, in addition to such measures, are effective coercive measures, sanctions to end Israeli impunity, and this is an obligation that all states have to cooperate to bring an end to a situation of illegality. And more broadly, in terms of the discourse that is evolving on Palestine, there's also a need to continue to recognize Israeli apartheid over the Palestinian people, and some members of US Congress have already begun to do so, which is a positive development.
Mm-hmm. There was a recent poll of American Jews who recognized that using the terminology apartheid, they did not consider that to be anti-Semitic. And it's so interesting because we know that former President Jimmy Carter wrote a book in the 70s calling Israel an apartheid state, which of course at that time, was so controversial. But it is very interesting to see these words become a normal part of the lexicon, and also for this very important delineation that being critical of specific policies of the Israeli government does not even make one anti-Israel, it just makes one critical of those specific policies. And it certainly doesn't make one anti-Semitic. I, for one, am a fan of respecting facts, respecting history, and I will always respect people who have faced incredible hardship and have shown resilience in the name of that. And I will always be someone who respects diversity of religion and race. And it's important that we have these principles and we respect them across the board. It is very, very important to respect Jewish history, and it is very important to recognize longstanding struggles of the Jewish people. It is also extremely important to recognize the history of Black Americans, Black people, the longstanding struggle of them, of Asian Americans, or, any community. And that, of course, includes the Palestinian people. Our history, my history, has a right to be respected, and my presence has a right to be respected, just as anyone else's does. And it's very interesting, I have to tell you, as a Democrat in the United States, working for a party that supposedly so values diversity, how oftentimes I will be, not silenced, but my presence will make people uncomfortable. And as we know through many of my African-American friends, I'm not going to be here just to be a token, just to check a box. If you truly value diversity, I am here as Bassima Alghussein, a proud Palestinian American, with my voice. This is me being diverse, showing up. And it is so important that we all use our platforms to not only amplify our own perspectives that we bring, but of those around us. And so, Mads, I have so much respect for you as a Norwegian who doesn't owe the Palestinian people, you know, a pinky of attention, to have dedicated so much time and effort and passion in your life to uplift and empower people who are not voiceless, but their voices have been silenced. And I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to work with you all today to help to get rid of some of this silence. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.